So before John sang Abide with Me today, I'm pretty sure the last time I heard that hymn was at a funeral, which isn't surprising. In America, at least, it's probably played at funerals and memorial services more than any other occasion. But at that funeral, even though I'd heard it for what felt like the millionth time, I found myself really listening to the words. And yeah, that's the problem with some things. They can become just so familiar to us, we kind of tune them out and our minds move on to stuff like our grocery list. But I realized in listening deeply to those lyrics that day that while Abide with Me, it's a great choice for something like a funeral, marking the end of this life and our transition to the next life. It feels like an even better choice for thinking about our lives as a whole, our perspective for understanding our relationships with each other and our relationship with God in the present. The melody that we're most familiar with for that hymn was an old tune called Eventide, composed in 1861 by William Henry Monk, who was a music publisher in England. The lyrics came from a poem written 14 years earlier in 1847 by an Anglican minister named Henry Francis Lyte. Henry served small churches located in little fishing and port towns on the southwest coast of England, where life in the mid-1800s could be pretty harsh. A lot of his parishioners were sailors and their families, and in those days, sailing was a dangerous profession. It wasn't unusual for sailors to not return from sea at all, and then for their families to be left destitute. And Henry himself suffered from serious respiratory issues throughout his life, asthma, bronchitis. Back in those days, the treatment options for breathing problems were limited and still pretty medieval compared to today. Whether it was his own health troubles or working among people who didn't have things easy, I think it's pretty safe to say Henry knew firsthand that life can be a hard road to navigate. Now, you never really know when someone writes a poem or the words to a song like that, what's motivating that creative impulse? Was Henry writing about death and the assurance of God's presence in the midst of death and dying? Yeah, but did he write it thinking this is going to be a big hit at funerals? Because it certainly has been. Is it meant to be a gloomy song, or is it just honest? Is it pessimistic, or is it ultimately hopeful? Okay, if you'll bear with me, here's my modern take on those classic lyrics. Stay with me. It's getting darker. When I'm feeling alone, I know you'll stay with me. Joy and beauty may be a passing thing, but I know that you never change, and you'll stay with me. With you, I have no fears, no burdens. Even dying is nothing to be afraid of, because you stay with me. Your presence shines through any darkness, because you stay with me. I know, that's not nearly as poetic. Henry's original is a lot better. But for me, Abide with Me is all about perspective. A healthy, honest perspective that life can be rough. It affirms that stuff happens, but that there's a way through that, knowing that we have each other and we have God to rely on no matter what happens. So I actually think of Abide with Me as a kind of a love song, a ballad that's celebrating that perspective of presence. There's a long conversation recorded for us in John's Gospel where Jesus concentrates on the importance of that perspective. He's talking to his followers about how they can be joyful in life and how true love is really about self-sacrifice. Anyone who stayed up all night with a colicky baby knows what I'm talking about. The thing is, Jesus says, the world can be hard. It is unfair and cruel and unpredictable. We all suffer loss, and we can all feel alone. But there's a miracle in the midst of that. The miracle is that love is stronger and more enduring than anything, and we know that love through the power of presence. The presence of one another, and in one another, we know the very presence of God. Having that outlook, that perspective, and believing in that truth can see us through anything. I think that's why these past 14 months, give or take, have been so challenging, because the physical presence of others that we rely on shrunk so drastically. Now, some people have been truly isolated, at least from their loved ones. Most of us have been fortunate enough to have one or two or a handful of folks we love and care for who we've been able to be around. But it's obviously still not the same, because all of our relationships matter. Our friends and even acquaintances matter, because their presence fulfills our need to understand our place in the world and our identity. In so many ways, we know who we are through other people. By that I mean that we are simply wired, we are created to function at our best when we have the opportunity to interact in person with others in helpful and self-giving and loving ways. It's hugely important to health, to our emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being, to be positively and lovingly present with other people. It generates joy and meaning and purpose. It builds love upon love. It's exactly what Jesus was talking about. But in different ways, the pandemic stole that from us. As of today, I think it feels to most of us that there is a light at the end of the COVID tunnel, but we know we're not completely out of the woods. People are still being infected and dying, although thankfully, compared to this time last year, more treatment therapies have been developed. More and more of us are being vaccinated, which in itself is something of a miracle that vaccines could even be developed and rolled out as quickly as they have been. Even then, it looks likely that with COVID variants, and variants, of course, happen with any virus, getting a COVID booster shot occasionally will be in our future long term. Maybe it'll be just like getting an annual flu shot. Who knows? But some areas, including around here, still have a pretty high number of cases. Some people are not being as careful as they should be. And gathering restrictions and mask wearing and social distancing are likely to be a feature of our daily lives for a long time to come. Many people will continue to work differently than before COVID, go to school differently, socialize differently, and travel differently. And different people have different tolerance levels for taking the risk of being around others. We need to respect that. They may have a medical condition, or they simply may feel uncomfortable at this point, and for a while to come, with attending any in-person gatherings. At our church, we're continuing to be very cautious and to take this seriously. We're going to hold a few outdoor worship services on Sundays this summer. The first one will be on June the 6th in 1 month, but we won't reopen fully for in-person indoor worship services until the Sunday after Labor Day, September 12th. At least that's our target date. Part of that has to do with the CDC and state guidelines that are still in place, but a really big part of it has to do with the fact that our sanctuary is not air conditioned. And the other spaces we have that are air conditioned are really just too small to ensure that everyone can gather together in there and be safe. So meeting inside in large numbers as the summer progresses, it simply isn't practical for us until the weather starts to cool off a little bit. So this whole experience is like a marathon. But unlike a normal race, we don't truly know how much further we need to go until we will cross a finish line. There are no mile markers in this race. And it's looking increasingly likely that there will be no clear finish line either, but more a series of graduated steps. And beyond those steps, what life will look like exactly is unclear. We only know it's highly unlikely the normal we were accustomed to will ever return 100%. There's no doubt that massive studies are underway and that thick books will be written attempting to document and describe the COVID-19 pandemic. And It's important for each of us to reflect on the past 14 months and how our lives have changed. It's important to remember what's been lost and who has been lost. The untold numbers of deaths, not just here, but around the world, the families devastated. The sheer emotional weight of that grief can never be measured. To pour salt on the wound of losing a loved one, the reality has been a cruel interruption of all the rituals and all the ways that we've normally been able to mark someone's passing. That ability to be present for someone, the opportunity to give a hug, break bread together, to share memories. And so many have gone through and are still going through economic hardship and incredible stress. Those who could already least afford the loss of a monthly paycheck, and that's tens of millions of our neighbors, have suffered and are suffering and are struggling to have enough food to eat, pay the rent, or even to find work. If some crazy scientist could devise a massive social experiment to see how we respond to a crisis where every life is affected and that tests all the systems we have in place and that we rely on all at once, COVID would be that scenario. Politics and government, healthcare and public safety, food supply, transportation, finance, education, you name it. I was able to get my COVID vaccinations through the Bucks County Health Department. They set up shop at the community college campus in Newtown. As I was receiving my doses, very gratefully I will say, both times I took a moment to just look around that big room. I wanted what I was living through to sink in. I wanted to remember every detail, all the people gathered there, all the workers, the massive logistics of it all. It was a communal, historic experience, and it was kind of mind-blowing to just ponder all the pieces that had to come together to get that stuff into my particular arm. In my lifetime, I cannot recall ever participating in something on that scale. And I pray that in so many parts of the world that are especially suffering right now, in India, Asia, Central and South America, Africa, in regions and countries where access to the vaccines is delayed by infrastructure and geopolitics, and quite frankly, regarding the populations there is not as high of a priority as people in Western countries, that they would see relief and experience the same levels of vaccine distribution that we have been privileged to have here. But the thing is, the reason COVID has hit us so hard is because this global experience is also so incredibly personal. No one has not been affected by it somehow. I know I'm stating the obvious. But what's not so obvious that really needs to be stated is that right in the middle of all the ways we've been affected and we will continue to be affected, we've somehow managed to hang in there. Now, that's not to diminish one bit the pain and the grief and the incredible suffering and stress people have gone through and they're still going through. But it's also a huge mistake to not also recognize all that's happening in the midst of that. We're not just hanging in there. What we have witnessed and experienced is nothing short of heroic. The self-sacrifice in the face of the unknown. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who's worked in a hospital or a clinic or a long-term care facility through this, they deserve a big gold medal and a full lifetime pension. And while we're at it, let's send them all on a year-long cruise to the Bahamas on ships decked out with giant flowing chocolate fountains. And that wouldn't even begin to compensate them for all they've done and all they continue to do. Medical workers, nurses, doctors, and staff members at healthcare facilities are the very embodiment of abide with me. And so are teachers. And so are people who work in grocery stores and who transport goods and food. So are utility workers and police officers and emergency medical crews and firefighters and garbage disposal workers. So are scientists and lab technicians. So are all the people who made it possible for us to hold an election last fall. So are business owners who had to learn how to operate in completely new ways that would turn my brain into a pretzel. So are warehouse workers and delivery drivers. Who have I missed? A ton of people. All the people who showed up and did their jobs so that as things all around us were shutting down, and most of us were scared out of our wits and not knowing what would happen next, as we hosed disinfectant on every last item that came into our homes. You remember those early days? They were present in the midst of that massive confusion and fear. Those folks are exactly who the lyrics of Abide With Me are talking about. Now, Abide With Me is ultimately about how we experience God. It's about having that perspective that God's always with us no matter what. And the proof of that abiding presence is found right here on the ground in the faces and voices and eyes and ears and hands and feet of the people we are blessed to share this imperfect and hurting world with. They're all around us if we wake up enough to recognize them. They are all of you, and God willing, me too. And the thing that ties all of us together, that makes abiding with each other a stronger and a more enduring reality than all the harsh and painful junk the world throws our way, is simply love. Self-giving, healing, understanding, sharing, forgiving, trusting, fear-smashing, hope-filled, joyful, abiding love. Thank God we're created that way, to abide in love, to experience that love of God in each other, and to look forward to where that love will take us.